Part 1. The Background. Chapter 1. Depression, Then and Now. The world you live in and your personal experiences of it are going to have a tremendous impact on your mood and your outlook on life. The world we live in today is changing at an incredible pace. This chapter explores depression within the context of our world, both historically and in the here and now. Understanding what is going on around you and how it might affect you can help you to better understand yourself. Once you've done that, you can tackle your moods and even your depression with more confidence. Depression through the ages. Depression has plagued mankind since the beginning of time. The word depression comes from the Latin terms down from, and premier, to press, meaning to be pressed down. Some other early terms used to describe the feelings of sadness and of being pressed down include dejection and depression of spirits. Throughout history, there has been much confusion as to whether depression itself was a disease or whether it was a combination of signs and symptoms of another disease. While thinking varied across the globe, treatments and therapeutic approaches in the ancient world were often cruel, unreasonable, and downright silly. During Hippocratic time, early 15th century BCE, it was believed that people's bodies were balanced by 4 elements: humors, blood, yellow bile, and black bile. An excess of black bile in the body was blamed for many illnesses, including headaches, epilepsy, vertigo, spasms, and depression of spirits. Too much black bile was thought to affect the brain, while Hippocrates identified as the center of emotion and mental illnesses. Not unlike our thinking today, Hippocrates was the first to treat depression with oral remedies and an early form of talk therapy. In the Middle Ages, from the late 5th to the 15th century CE, many people thought depression was the result of an imperfect soul, and that it was punishment for having angered God, or for having sinned. During the Inquisition, some people were fined or imprisoned for their depression. People also believed that those who suffered from mental illnesses were possessed by devils or demons. People suffering from depression were sent to work in manual labor camps, and families and friends were told to abandon them. The hope was that work and isolation would redeem them, that God would forgive them. During the Renaissance, 16th and 17th century, depression was linked to 2 pressing social issues: genius and witchcraft. The English romanticized depression, then called as a kind of soulfulness and a sign of genius. It was considered an illness that was beyond the control of those suffering from it, and treatments including exercise, listening to music, and changes in diet. The Dutch retained the earlier thinking that depression was caused by some sort of evil possession, although they did believe that it was not the fault of the depressed people. Exorcism were often attempted to deliver evil spirits from the bodies of the possessed. During this time, some argued that witches were not really evil, just foolish and depressed old women. The idea that these women were mentally ill saved many of them from being executed. The Age of Reason, 18th century, was probably the worst time to be depressed. At this point in history, people's thinking turned from the soulful to the scientific. The human body was regarded as a machine, a scientific wonder, and someone who was depressed or considered to have no self-discipline. Severe punishments were imposed on the depressed and mentally ill. They were sentenced to life in asylums as social outcasts without rights and with no chance of recovery. For this reason, those who were not severely mentally ill kept their depression hidden and suffered alone. Things got a bit better in the Romantic and Victorian eras, 19th century, as those who suffered from melancholia were considered once again to be brilliant and soulful. During this time, the depressed were treated as people, not as animals or moral deviants. Many new asylums were opened that focused on treating the individual, and these became a sort of community for those who lived in them. Families willingly admitted their loved ones into the asylums, no longer fearing they might be mistreated. Treatments for depression included walks, reading, music, and exercise. At this time, people also reverted to the 5th century belief that depression was a disease of the brain, and brain autopsies became quite common, especially when someone committed suicide. In modern times, 20th century, there have been two schools of thought about depression and mental illness. Sigmund Freud talked about the powers of the mind, subconscious, and proposed the important idea that depression is really anger turned inwards. Emil proposed that depression is biochemical and has strong links to heredity, implying that if you are genetically predisposed to depression, then you are pretty much doomed. A man named Adolf Meyer bridged these two theories, proposing that each person is unique and capable of change. He believed that people's social environment has a great impact on how they feel and who they are. In 1950, the first antidepressant was developed, which led the way to many new treatments for depression and other mental illness.